It started not with a bang, but with the silent, sterile chill of a press release. I saw it on an industry blog before anyone had the courage to tell me. RA Inc. embraces new vision with Chloe Varon, a fresh voice for a new generation. The words were like smooth, polished riverstones, designed to glide past the truth without friction. They called my departure a planned transition, a mutual decision to explore new creative horizons. They thanked me for my foundational contributions to their flagship scent, Aura Nobilis. Foundational. As if I had merely poured the concrete for a building someone else had designed and built. I was the architect, the engineer, and the artist. I was the ghost in that machine, and they had just performed a public exorcism. It was then, reading those bloodless words on my phone, while the scent of my own creation, the one that had built their empire, still lingered on my skin, that the first cold click of the tumblers falling into place began. They had forgotten. In their rush to replace the old with the new, the master with the model, the expensive with the expedient, they had forgotten the one thing they couldn't own. They had the recipe, but they had forgotten about the soul. If you've ever poured your entire being into something, only to have it taken from you and handed to someone else, then you know the unique kind of silence that follows. It's a silence that is louder than any screaming match. It's the sound of your own value being erased. It helps to know I'm not just speaking into the void here. If this story resonates with you, let me know in the comments. It's important to be reminded that we're not alone in these fights. The meeting itself had been a masterpiece of corporate cowardice. It took place in Alistair Finch's office, a sterile glass box overlooking the city, a view paid for almost entirely by the perfume I had created. He didn't sit behind his massive mahogany desk, the one that looked like a prop from a movie about soulless titans of industry. Instead, he perched on the edge of it, leaning forward in a pantomime of sincerity, his tie perfectly dimpled, his smile as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. He smelled faintly of citrus and ambition. He spoke of the market, of demographics, of the need for a face that could connect with the TikTok generation. He used words like synergy and disruption and brand narrative. He said it wasn't personal. It never is it? It's just business. He explained that Chloe, the 24-year-old influencer whose main contribution to the world of fragrance was posting filtered photos of perfume bottles next to her lattes, had a unique and authentic connection to the youth market. Alistair had always been good with words that meant nothing. I just sat there in one of the brutally uncomfortable chairs he reserved for guests, and I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend the 20 years I had dedicated to my craft, the decade I had spent inside his company, turning it from a middling cosmetics house into a global fragrance powerhouse. I didn't mention the billion-dollar valuation that Aura Nobilis had single-handedly delivered. I just watched him, my hands resting in my lap, my breathing even. I learned long ago that in moments of conflict, the person who maintains their composure holds the power. My silence was a mirror, and I could see his discomfort reflected in it. He expected tears or anger or pleading. He had a script in his head for how this was supposed to play out, and my quiet stillness was forcing him to improvise. He slid a heavy embossed envelope across the desk. It had my name on it, spelled correctly for once. Inside was a check with an offensive number of zeros on it. He called it a parting gift, a gesture of gratitude for my legacy. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and foul. A legacy is what you leave behind when you are dead, and that's what he was doing. He was burying me. He followed it with the line that sealed his fate. He said, "We are so grateful that you left the formula for Aura Nobilis in such a complete and accessible state for the team. We own it now, of course, but the tidiness is appreciated." He smiled again, that thin, sharp smile. He thought he was closing a chapter. He had no idea he was starting a war. I stood up, took the envelope, and gave him a small, polite nod. "Thank you for the opportunity, Alistair. I wish you and Chloe all the best." My voice was steady, betraying none of the seismic activity happening beneath the surface. His relief was palpable. He had gotten through it. The difficult woman had been managed. As I walked to the door, he called out, "Oh, and Grace will have security escort you to your office to collect your personal effects. Protocol, you understand?" I understood perfectly. I was no longer a person. I was a security risk. I didn't turn around. I just raised a hand in acknowledgement and walked out of his glass cage, the silence of my departure more damning than any parting shot I could have fired. The real parting shot was already loaded, chambered, and waiting. It just wasn't a gun. It was a flower. A single impossible flower, growing only in one remote corner of the world, a place he couldn't find on a map, a place that didn't answer to his money or his threats, a place that answered only to me. The drive home was a blur. The city lights smeared across the windshield like wet paint. I kept the radio off. The silence in the car was a physical presence, a heavy blanket pressing down on my chest. I parked in my designated spot beneath my apartment building, but I couldn't bring myself to get out of the car. I just sat there in the concrete silence of the underground garage, the engine ticking as it cooled. My composure, the mask I had worn so carefully in Alistair's office, began to crack. It started as a tremor in my hands, then a tightness in my throat that felt like swallowing stones. I leaned my forehead against the cold steering wheel, and for the first time in a very long time, I let the silence be filled with sound. Not a scream, not a yell, but a deep, ragged sob that seemed to come from the very foundation of my being. It was the sound of 20 years of dedication being dismissed in a 20-minute meeting. It was the sound of my art, my child, being handed over to a vapid stranger who wouldn't know a top note from a bass note. It was the sound of betrayal. The scent of aura nobilis on my scarf, usually a comfort, was now an accusation. Every molecule of it was a memory. I could smell the sharp green scent of galbanum that reminded me of my first failed attempts. The creamy, almost buttery note of the specific tuberose absolute I had fought for months to source, a battle I had won against a budget committee that wanted a cheaper, synthetic version. And beneath it all, the heart, the secret, the thing that made it all sing, the orchidée fantôme, the ghost orchid, a scent that was not a scent, but an experience. It was a whisper of vanilla, a hint of almond, a touch of something ethereal and almost floral, but not quite. It was the smell of starlight, I used to joke. It was the smell of a secret, my secret. My mind started to drift back, sorting through memories like a librarian searching for a specific, misplaced book. I remembered my first meeting with Alistair, 10 years ago. He was all charm and vision then, a charismatic leader who spoke of building a brand based on uncompromising quality. He had sought me out, flown to Paris where I was working for a small prestigious perfumery, and sold me a dream. He said he wanted an artist, not a technician. He said, "Grace, I don't want you to make us a perfume. I want you to create a legacy." The irony was so thick, it was suffocating. He'd used the right words then, too. He just hadn't meant them. Then came the years of creation. I wasn't just in the lab. I lived in it. My world shrank to the size of 1,000 tiny glass vials. I worked through nights, weekends, holidays. I filled notebooks with formulas, with thoughts, with failures. Aura nobilis wasn't born in a flash of inspiration. It was excavated. I chipped away at it, slowly, painstakingly, for 2 solid years. It was a puzzle with a missing piece. The fragrance was beautiful, but it was hollow. It had no soul. It was just a collection of expensive ingredients. It needed a ghost. And that sent my memory spinning further back, to my father. He wasn't a perfumer. He was a botanist, a quiet, gentle man who saw the world in shades of green. He spent his life traveling to the most remote corners of the globe, searching for new species. He was the one who first told me about the Antananarivo family in Madagascar. He'd stumbled upon their village in the Marojejshi National Park while tracking a rare lemur. They were, for lack of a better term, orchid whisperers. For generations, they had been the sole custodians of a unique, unclassified species of orchid that bloomed for only a few nights a year under the light of a full moon. It had no color, its petals were almost translucent, which is why they called it the ghost orchid. They had a unique, cold extraction process, a secret passed from father to son that could capture its impossible scent, a scent that was so delicate, so complex, that modern science couldn't map it. My father had been fascinated. He'd sent me a tiny wax-sealed vial of the absolute. I was just an apprentice then, barely 20 years old. When I opened it, I knew. I knew this was the kind of secret that could define a life's work. My father died a few years later, a sudden heart attack in the field. He never got to publish his findings on the orchid. The scientific community never even knew it existed. But he left me his journals, his maps, and his connection to the Antananarivo family. He left me the key. Years later, when I was wrestling with the soulless perfection of what would become Aura Nobilis, I remembered that vial. I dug out my father's old, leather-bound journal. I found the hand-drawn maps and the notes. It wasn't about revenge then. It was about legacy, my father's and my own. I booked a flight to Madagascar. I didn't tell Alistair the specifics, only that I was pursuing a unique raw material. His eyes had glazed over at the mention of sourcing trips. That was my world, the messy, unglamorous part he didn't care about. He just wanted the magic in the bottle. I arrived in the small village and met Jean-Luc Antananarivo, the family patriarch. He was a man with deep, kind eyes and hands that looked like they were carved from the earth itself. He remembered my father. He spoke of him with a reverence that brought tears to my eyes. We didn't talk business for 3 days. We drank tea. We walked through the forest. He showed me the orchids, sleeping on the trunks of ancient rosewood trees. He told me the stories of his ancestors. He told me the orchid chose its partners. It could not be tamed or sold to just anyone. It required respect. On the 3rd night, we sat by a small fire, and I told him what I wanted to do. I wanted to build a great perfume around the soul of his family's flower. I wanted to honor it. We didn't use corporate lawyers or complex contracts. That wasn't his way. It wasn't my father's way. I had a simple, 1-page agreement drafted. My lawyer back in Paris had called it poetically unenforceable, but he was wrong. It was the most enforceable contract I ever signed because it wasn't built on legal threats, but on mutual trust. The agreement was between Grace Renaud, the perfumer, and the Antananarivo family. It stated that the absolute of the Orchidée Fantôme was for my exclusive, personal use in my artistic creations for as long as I wished to use it. The company I worked for, Aura Inc., was never mentioned. Not once. It was a contract of honor, a promise between families, a promise Alistair Finch had no idea existed. Back in the present, the cold of the steering wheel seeped into my skin. The initial wave of grief was receding, replaced by something else, a slow, cold burn. I thought of my apprentice, Amélie, a brilliant young woman with a nose that was already sharper than most veterans in the industry. I had taken her under my wing, taught her everything I knew, except for the one final secret. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I wanted to protect her. She had been my eyes and ears in the lab for the last year, quietly telling me about the budget meetings I was no longer invited to, about Alistair's new consultants who knew more about marketing than methanol. Her loyalty was a small, warm light in the growing darkness. The breakdown was over. The tears had dried, leaving behind a salty, metallic resolve. My phone buzzed. It was a message on a secure app. One Amélie and I used to talk freely. The screen glowed in the darkness of the garage. It read, "They're in the lab. Chloe and 2 technicians. They have your final formula. They're running it through the gas chromatograph, trying to isolate the signature note. Chloe called it that weird vanilla thing. They think they can synthesize it by next week." A bitter laugh escaped my lips. It was a dry, hollow sound. Let them try. Let them point their science at a ghost. They would capture its shadow, but never its presence. And then, a second message. An email this time, from an address I knew by heart. It was from Jean-Luc. The subject line was simply, "The Moon." The body of the email was just as sparse, just as powerful. "The orchids are sleeping now, Grace. The season is over. They will sleep until you tell them it is time to wake. We are with you. The family is with you." That was it. That was the catalyst. The despair washed away, scoured clean by a tidal wave of cold, hard clarity. This wasn't an ending. It was an ignition sequence. Alistair thought he had bought a masterpiece. What he had actually bought was a beautiful, hollow, billion-dollar frame, and I had just walked out the door with the painting. It wasn't about revenge. I kept telling myself that. It was about restoration. It was about reminding a world obsessed with cheap copies of the value of an original. I started the car. The engine purred to life, a low growl in the concrete silence. I put it in drive and pulled out of the garage, heading not for my apartment, but for a small anonymous building across town. A place Alistair didn't know about. My real lab. My sanctuary. The war room. My personal lab was my secret garden. A place I had built slowly over the years, piece by piece, with my own money. It was tucked away in a converted warehouse district, anonymous from the outside, but a temple to olfaction within. It smelled of potential, of raw materials, of alcohol, of paper blotters holding the ghosts of 100 different ideas. It was the one place in the world where I was completely sovereign. Alistair knew I tinkered at home. He just imagined a little desk with some essential oils. Not this. Not a fully equipped, professional-grade perfumery organ with over 3,000 raw materials, a small-batch distiller, and my own gas chromatograph, a far more sensitive model than the one at Aura. He saw me as an employee, a cog in his machine. He never saw me as an independent power. That was his fatal mistake. He underestimated me. They always do. I switched on the lights. They hummed to life, illuminating the rows upon rows of amber-tinted bottles, each one a word in a language only I could speak. This was my arsenal. I walked over to a climate-controlled vault in the corner of the room. I typed in a code, and the heavy door hissed open. Inside, nestled in velvet-lined shelves, were my most precious materials. And there, on the central shelf, was my entire personal stock of Orchidée Fantôme Absolute. It wasn't a huge quantity, maybe half a liter in total, but it was enough. It was the seed. From this, a new forest could grow. Beside it was a fireproof document box. I opened it and pulled out the contract. The original one-page agreement with Jean-Luc Andrienerivo. The paper was thick, handmade. The ink slightly faded. I ran my fingers over my signature and his. It was written in French, with a Malagasy translation penned below it in Jean-Luc's elegant script. My lawyer's voice echoed in my head. Poetically unenforceable. What he, a man of Western law, failed to grasp was that in many parts of the world, a person's word, a family's honor, is a bond stronger than any notarized document. Alistair could send 100 lawyers to Madagascar. They would find nothing. No corporate entity, no subsidiary, no paper trail leading back to Ore Inc. The contract was between a woman named Grace and a man named Jean-Luc. It was an agreement about art and respect. The corporate world, with its language of mergers and acquisitions, had no vocabulary for such a thing. This was the core of my plan, the foundation upon which everything would be built. I hadn't created it in a panic after being fired. I had laid the groundwork years ago, not because I was plotting a dramatic exit, but as a simple act of self-preservation. It was a lesson my father had taught me. Never give away the source of your water, he'd said. Let them drink from your well, but always keep the map to the spring. I had let Ori Inc. drink, and they had grown fat and powerful on my water. Now I was turning off the tap. It wasn't just about the contract, it was about the science. I powered up my chromatograph and pulled up the file on the ghost orchid. I had spent years analyzing it, not to replicate it, but to understand its mystery. The machine could identify hundreds of volatile compounds, vanillins. Yes, Chloe wasn't entirely wrong, but she was seeing a single tree and calling it a forest. There were esters, aldehydes, lactones, but the machine always had a blind spot. There were gaps in the data, ghost peaks that would appear and vanish, compounds so ephemeral, so fragile, that the heat of the injection port destroyed them before they could be identified. These were the molecules that gave the orchid its magic. They were the soul, and they could not be synthesized because they could not be named. They could only be preserved through the Andrienerivo family's traditional, heatless extraction method, a method they would never share. A method Chloe's technicians, with their sterile equipment and their brute force approach, would only desecrate. They weren't just going to fail to replicate it, they were going to create a chemical caricature, an insult to its memory. My allies were already in place, dominoes set up and waiting for the gentlest of pushes. The first and most important was Amelie. She was more than just an apprentice. She was the daughter I never had. I saw in her the same fire, the same reverence for the art that I had when I was her age. Our relationship was the subplot. Alistair never bothered to read. He saw her as my assistant, a glorified secretary. He had no idea she was a prodigy. I had been grooming her not just as a perfumer, but as my successor, the keeper of my legacy, should she choose to be. Her messages were my lifeline, a direct feed from inside the collapsing empire. She told me of the growing panic. The first few batches of the new aura nobilis had been rushed into production. The quality control lab, the one I had established and trained, kept flagging them. The reports came back with cold clinical precision. Lacks characteristic ethereal top note. Base notes are thin. Noticeable synthetic vanillin artifact. Chloe, Amelie told me, was throwing tantrums. She blamed the suppliers of the other ingredients. She blamed the equipment. She blamed me, claiming I had sabotaged the master formula. Alistair, blinded by his own arrogance and desperate to protect his chosen one, believed her. They were chasing ghosts, fighting shadows, while the real problem was something they couldn't even comprehend. They were running out of the real thing. Each new bottle of aura nobilis on the shelf was a step closer to the end. My second ally was Jean-Luc, a continent away but closer to my heart than anyone at Aure. Our communication was sparse, but profound. I sent him a simple message. The winter has come. Let the garden sleep. He replied almost instantly. The garden is safe. It waits for the spring you will bring. He didn't need explanations or long-winded emails. He understood. He had already begun the process of plausible deniability we had discussed years ago as a worst-case scenario. He had sent a formal letter to Aure's procurement department, a letter I had helped him draft. It spoke of a rare fungal blight and unpredictable climate shifts that had decimated the year's orchid harvest. He expressed his deepest regrets. The supply, he explained, would be non-existent for the foreseeable future. It was a masterpiece of corporate speak, just believable enough to be accepted, just vague enough to be unprovable. They had no idea the blight was named Alistair, and the climate shift was named Grace. And then there was my father's legacy. This part of the plan was not strategic. It was emotional, but it was the fuel for everything. In my vault, next to the contract, I kept his journals. I spent an hour that first night just reading his elegant script, looking at his detailed drawings of the orchid. He wrote about the Andrianarivo family with such warmth. He wrote about the orchid not as a specimen to be catalogued, but as a miracle to be revered. He believed its unique scent was a form of communication, a language older than man. This fight wasn't just for my career, it was for him. It was to ensure his discovery wasn't cheapened, wasn't turned into a synthetic vanilla note in a bottle sold by an influencer. It felt in a strange way like I was defending his honor as much as my own. This wasn't about revenge, it was about protecting a memory. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place the next day. I met with my lawyer, Eleanor Vance. She wasn't part of a massive, soulless firm. She operated out of a small, elegant brownstone and specialized in intellectual property for artists and creators. She had sharp eyes and a sharper mind. I laid out the whole story. The contract, the secret ingredient, Alistair's assumption of ownership. I expected a long, complex legal battle. Eleanor listened patiently, read the contract with the Andrianarivo family, and then a slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. "Grace," she said, leaning back in her chair, "this is beautiful. This is a fortress." She explained the legal nuances. Fragrance formulas themselves are notoriously difficult to patent. They are often protected as trade secrets. Alistair's company owned the formula, the list of ingredients and their proportions that I had logged in their systems. That much was true. They owned the recipe for the cake, but they did not own the one, irreplaceable, secret source flour required to bake it. And thanks to my foresight, and my father's, they had no legal claim or path to that flour. "So we sue them?" I asked. "For what?" she countered. "They haven't done anything illegal, technically. They are simply exercising their ownership over a trade secret they possess. A trade secret that is about to become completely and utterly worthless." Her advice was cold, brilliant, and perfectly aligned with my own instincts. "Do nothing," she said. "Don't send a cease and desist. Don't make threats. Let them launch their synthetic garbage. Let them dilute their remaining stock. Let them destroy their own brand from the inside out. A lawsuit is noisy and expensive. Silence is free. And in this case, it is far more lethal. Your move is not to fight them. It's to make them irrelevant. I left her office with a feeling of profound, chilling calm. The path was clear. It wasn't a path of destruction, but of creation. I wouldn't tear down Alistair's house. I would simply build a more beautiful one next door and let all of his inhabitants willingly walk over to mine. The plan was no longer just a reaction. It was a strategy, a quiet, patient, and utterly devastating one. I went back to my lab, the scent of 1,000 possibilities in the air, and I began to work. My first move was silent, almost imperceptible. A ripple, not a wave. I spent a week in my lab doing nothing but creating. I wasn't trying to replicate Aura Nobilis. That was a ghost I was willing to let go. Instead, I took a fragment of its soul, the ghost orchid, and gave it a new body. I built a new fragrance around it, something that was recognizably my work, my signature, but different. It was lighter, more complex, with a top note of pear and pink peppercorn, and a base of ambrette seed and a touch of aged sandalwood. It was the scent of a clear horizon after a storm. I called it Lob, the dawn. I decanted it into a dozen small, anonymous glass vials. No label, no branding, just a simple, handwritten tag with the name. I didn't issue a press release or call a journalist. That was Alistair's way. Loud, boastful, and empty. My way was a whisper. I chose my targets carefully. 3 of the most influential fragrance bloggers in the world, people who valued art over advertising. The head buyer for Bergdorf Goodman, a woman named Sylvie, who had been my champion for years and had always lamented that the brand got more credit than the artist. And finally, 5 of my oldest, most loyal private clients, the kind of people who don't just buy perfume, they collect it. I put each vial in a simple, elegant box, cushioned with black silk, and sent them out with a 1-line handwritten note, "A new chapter begins." Then I waited. It was the hardest part. The silence was deafening. For a week, nothing happened. I had to fight the urge to check the blogs every 5 minutes, to call Sylvie, to do something. I forced myself to stay in the lab, to work on other formulas, to trust the process, to trust the power of the scent itself. It was an act of faith. Meanwhile, the reports from Amelie grew more and more frantic. She was my periscope into the sinking ship. The atmosphere at Aura Inc. had turned toxic. The reformulated Aura Nobilis was now in production, a pale chemical ghost of its former self. The first shipments had gone out to retailers. The company was in a state of managed panic. Alistair had launched a massive new marketing campaign around Chloe, pushing her as the vibrant new face of the brand, hoping the gloss and glamour would distract from the hollowness in the bottle. Amelie described a meeting where the head of quality control, a stoic man I had hired and trained, presented a report. He had graphs, he had chemical analysis, he had early consumer feedback from test panels. The results were damning. He concluded, in his typically understated way, that the new product did not meet the established quality standard for Aura Nobilis. Chloe, Amelie said, had accused him of being loyal to the old regime and of sabotaging her launch. Alistair had backed her, of course. He'd reassigned the QC director to a new role overseeing warehouse logistics. He was silencing anyone who spoke the truth. He was plugging the alarms on the Titanic because the noise was ruining the party on the deck. They were cutting the remaining stock of the authentic perfume with the new synthetic version to stretch it out. A 10% dilution at first, then 20, then 50. They were treating their customers like fools, assuming they wouldn't notice. It was the ultimate act of contempt for the very people who had made them rich. It was a gamble based on the belief that brand loyalty was stronger than sensory truth, a bet they were about to lose in spectacular fashion. The first ripple came from a small, highly respected, independent fragrance blog. The writer, a woman who went by the moniker The Scented Skeptic, wrote a post titled, "A Ghost in the Mail." She described receiving an anonymous vial. She wrote about it with a reverence that made my heart ache. "I don't know who made this," she wrote, "but it is the work of a master. There's a familiar soul here, a signature I feel I know, but it has been reborn. It is a fragrance that doesn't shout, it hums. It smells of quiet confidence, of earned wisdom. If aura nobilis was a love affair, this is true love. She didn't mention me by name, but she didn't have to. The comparison was enough. The post was shared hundreds, then thousands of times. The comments section exploded. Who was this mystery perfumer? Was the queen in exile? The next day, Sylvie from Bergdorf's called me on my personal cell. "Grace," she said, her voice a low conspiracy. "I have a vial of dawn on my desk, and I just received my first shipment of the new aura nobilis." She paused. "What have they done, Grace? It smells cheap. It smells like a lie." I stayed quiet, letting her speak. "We're getting complaints," she continued. "Emails from customers, people who have worn this scent for years. They're asking if it's a counterfeit. My massive fall order, I'm putting it on hold. I'm citing quality control issues." It was the first real shot fired. Not by me, but for me. I thanked her, my voice thick with emotion. She just said, "Art must be defended, Grace. We'll speak soon." This was the tipping point. The panic at Aura Inc. went critical. Amélie told me Alistair was a man possessed. He was screaming in meetings. He saw conspiracies everywhere. He was convinced I had launched a smear campaign, that I had paid off the bloggers, that I was bribing the retailers. The idea that his product was simply inferior was incomprehensible to him. His ego was a fortress that admitted no fault. He put his legal team on high alert, tasking them with finding a way to sue me. "For what?" they asked. "For everything," he'd roared. The final public blow came from a scathing article in a major fashion magazine. The journalist was one of the people I had sent a vial to. The piece was a brutal takedown, not of me, but of Aura Inc. It was titled, "The Emperor's New Scent: How Aura Inc. Lost Its Soul." It detailed the quiet backlash from consumers, the phantom formula that smelled thin and chemical, the rumors of a mystery perfumer operating in the shadows. It interviewed anonymous sources from within the industry, perfumers, buyers, critics, all of whom lamented the decline of a once great fragrance. The article ended with a devastating line: "Aura Inc. may own the name Aura Nobilis, but it appears they have lost the aura and the nobility." Alistair's world was catching fire. The smoke was visible to everyone, and I hadn't struck a single match. I had simply built a shelter for the coming rain, and the storm had arrived right on schedule. It wasn't about revenge, it was about consequence. The silent, inevitable consequence of arrogance and disrespect. My phone rang again. It was an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A few moments later, a message appeared. It was from Alistair. His voice was strained, the easy confidence gone, replaced by a desperate edge. "Grace, we need to talk. Call me." I deleted the message. My new chapter had begun. There was no reason to read from the old book. The exodus began as a trickle, then became a flood. It wasn't just the clients. It was the talent. The first to leave Aura Inc. was the head of quality control, the man Alistair had exiled to the warehouse. He sent me his resume with a simple note. "I prefer working with people who believe in facts." I hired him immediately to oversee production for my new, still unnamed company. Next came two of the most promising junior perfumers from the lab, young talents I had personally mentored, who told me they couldn't stand to watch Chloe desecrate the art any longer. They didn't even ask about salary, they just wanted to be in a place where creativity was valued. The biggest move came from Sylvie at Bergdorf's. After putting her initial order on hold, she formally canceled the entire fall and holiday contract for Aura Nobilis, a multi-million-dollar deal. She sent an email to Alistair, which was promptly forwarded to me by a sympathetic contact in the executive suite, stating that due to an unprecedented number of negative customer reviews and a demonstrable decline in product quality, we can no longer in good faith offer Aura Nobilis to our clientele. She then called me and offered my new company, Maison de Grace, an exclusive launch partnership for Loeb. Alistair finally connected the dots. The anonymous vials, the blogger posts, the cancelled contracts, it all pointed back to me. His panic curdled into a desperate, frantic attempt to regain control. He called me. This time, I answered. His voice was a strange cocktail of feigned warmth and barely concealed rage. "Grace, darling," he began. The the word darling landing with a thud. I hear you've been creative. Listen, I think there's been a misunderstanding, a breakdown in communication. I let the silence hang in the air. I didn't help him. Chloe is, well, she's young, he stammered. She's still finding her footing. The brand needs your steady hand, Grace. It needs its mother. Its mother. The audacity was breathtaking. I had gone from a foundational contributor to the brand's mother in the span of a few disastrous weeks. I want to make you an offer, he said, his voice lowering into a conspiratorial whisper. A new role, Chief Creative Officer, for the entire fragrance division, a 7-figure salary, a percentage of the profits. Whatever you want, we just need you to come home. I listened to his desperate pitch, a part of me marveling at the sheer, unadulterated ego of the man. He still thought this was about money or a title. He still believed he could buy me back, that my integrity, my art, had a price tag. He was a man who only understood transactions, not relationships. Alistair, I said, my voice calm and even, that is a very generous offer. I could hear the relief in his exhale. He thought he had me. But I'm afraid I must decline, I continued. You see, you already own the formula for Aura Nobilis. You assured me it was complete and accessible. I have complete confidence in your new team's ability to manage it. Grace, don't be like this, he snapped, the mask of civility slipping. This is a game to you. You're trying to destroy us. It wasn't about destroying him. It was about building myself. No, Alistair, I replied, the coolness in my voice now glacial. I'm not playing a game. I'm simply working. I'm a perfumer. It's what I do. My work now belongs to my own company, and I'm afraid I'm very busy. Before he could respond, before he could pivot to threats or more pleading, I ended the call. The click of the disconnect was one of the most satisfying sounds I had ever heard. It was the sound of a door closing for good. The power had shifted. It wasn't a hostile takeover. It was a quiet abdication. He had willingly given away his queen, and only now, in the middle of a losing game, did he realize she was the most powerful piece on the board. The final confrontation wasn't in a boardroom or a lawyer's office. It was at the industry's annual awards gala, the Oscars of fragrance. I wasn't there to receive an award, not yet. I was there as Sylvie's guest. I was wearing a simple black dress and a dab of lobe on my wrists. I didn't need to make a statement. My presence was the statement. From across the crowded room, I saw Alistair. He looked smaller, somehow. His suit, usually so impeccable, seemed to hang off his frame. He was standing alone, a glass of champagne untouched in his hand. People were avoiding him, giving him a wide berth as if his failure were contagious. He saw me. His eyes narrowed, and he started making his way through the crowd. A man on a mission. He cornered me near the terrace, the city lights twinkling behind him. He smelled of desperation and stale champagne. You, he hissed, his voice low and venomous. You did this. You stole from me. You stole my formula, my clients, my staff. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him, not with hatred, but with a profound, weary pity. Alistair, I said, my voice barely a whisper, forcing him to lean in. I stole nothing. The formula you have is the one I gave you. The clients left because you sold them a lie. The staff left because they wanted to work for an artist, not a marketer. You didn't lose them. You threw them away. I will sue you into oblivion, he snarled. Theft of trade secrets. Tortious interference. My lawyers will bury you. I almost smiled. Sue me for what? I asked, my voice genuinely curious. For having a relationship with a family in Madagascar? For creating a new perfume in my own lab on my own time? You can't sue someone for their memories, Alistair. You can't own a promise made between two families half a world away. You have the recipe, I said, delivering the final blow. But you will never, ever have the soul. I held his gaze for a moment longer, letting the truth of it land, watching the fight go out of his eyes, replaced by a hollow, dawning horror. Then I simply turned and walked away, leaving him alone with the wreckage of the empire he had built, and then dismantled with his own 2 hands. 2 weeks later, the news broke. The board of directors at Aura Inc., facing a catastrophic drop in stock price and a full-scale consumer revolt had voted to remove Alistair Finch as CEO. He was gone. Chloe Varon had been quietly released from her contract months earlier, disappearing from the social media landscape as quickly as she had appeared. The brand Aura Nobilis was being indefinitely discontinued. It was over. The news came to me in an email from Amelie, who was now my partner, my head of creation, sitting across from me in our new, sun-drenched atelier, our own space. It was bright and airy, filled with plants and light, a world away from the cold corporate labs we had left behind. We didn't celebrate with champagne. We just shared a look, a quiet understanding of the journey we had taken. My vindication wasn't in Alistair's fall. It was in my own rise. It was in the feel of my name, Grace Renault, on the door. It was in the sight of my loyal team, working with passion and joy. It was in the call I received that afternoon from Jean-Luc, his voice warm and happy, telling me the orchids were blooming again, more vibrant than ever, and that the first shipment of the new harvest was on its way. For me, for us, I had built my own throne, not on the ashes of his, but on a foundation of integrity, respect, and true, uncompromising artistry. I picked up a finished bottle of Loba from my desk. The glass was heavy and cool in my hand. The liquid inside seemed to glow. It wasn't a scent of revenge. It was a scent of rebirth. It was never about the money, or the fame, or even about seeing Alistair fail. It was about a simple, fundamental principle, that true value cannot be bought or sold. It cannot be stolen or copied. It has to be earned. It has to be nurtured. It resides in the things you cannot quantify on a balance sheet, in the trust you build, in the promises you keep, in the quiet dedication to your craft. They tried to erase my name, but they forgot that my signature wasn't on a piece of paper in their files. It was in the air. And that's the real moral of the story. It's for anyone who has ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told that their contribution was merely foundational. Your true worth isn't in your job title. It's not in the logo on your business card or the salary they pay you. It is in your skill. It is in your integrity. It's in the relationships you build and the quiet promises you keep, to others and to yourself. Those are the assets they can never take from you. They are the secret ingredients to a life of your own making. You are the architect of your own soul. Don't ever let anyone else claim ownership of the blueprint. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever felt that sting of being undervalued, please do me a favor and hit that like button. It truly helps, and it lets me know that these stories matter. Leave a comment below and share your own experience. Our collective stories are our strength. Share this video with anyone you think might need to hear it, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel for more stories about reclaiming your power. It means the world to know we're in this together.